The fact that we can imagine and discuss these two infinities, the infinity of the small and infinity of the large, and actually think about them scientifically, to me, is a reason to celebrate that it's a triumph of the human mind that we can conceive and even explore scientifically these two different infinities. I think is a great tribute to the power of the human mind.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Alan Lightman is an American writer, physicist, and social entrepreneur. He served on the faculties of Harvard and MIT, and was the first person at MIT to receive dual faculty appointments in science and in the humanities. Currently, he serves as professor for the practice of the humanities at MIT. In his scientific research, he has made fundamental contributions to the astrophysics of black holes and cosmic radiative processes. He is the author of numerous books, both fiction and nonfiction, including Einstein's Dreams, an international bestseller, The Diagnosis, a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction, and his latest book, Probable Impossibilities, Musings on Beginnings and Endings, where he discusses questions of nothingness and infinity, the mind, and the specialness of life. Alan's essays and articles have appeared in The Atlantic, Granta, Harper's, Nautilus, The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, Salon, and many other publications. In this conversation, we talk about growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, and living between physics and the humanities, what it was like to study physics at Princeton and Caltech, working with Richard Feynman, writing Einstein's Dreams, the connection between physics and spirituality, the topics of entropy and life, the rarity of life, on nothingness and infinity, on the value of wasting time, and many other topics. This conversation with Alan Lightman is one of a dozen or more upcoming conversations with best-selling authors, thinkers, designers, scientists, and makers who are reimagining our world and experience. So please follow us on your favorite podcasting app if you haven't already, so that you can make sure you don't miss them. And now let's jump right in with Alan Lightman. All right, I'm sitting here with Alan Lightman. Alan, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be with you.
So I like to start this conversation these days with kind of the human situation that we're all in. And I'd love to hear about how COVID affected you, where it found you, and what was your experience? Because what I find is that it's radically different from person to person, from area to area.
I think one of the silver linings of COVID, I mean, we all know about the great destruction it's done physically and economically. One of the silver linings that has forced a lot of people to slow down. I think that in the modern world, we live much too fast for our own good. And of course, the high speed of communication with the internet and the smartphone has exacerbated that and caused that. The pace of life has always been regulated by the speed of communication. And speed of communication has increased exponentially since the 1980s. And by not having time to slow down, we don't have as much time as we need to personally reflect on what's important to us, to reflect on our values, reflect where we're going, both as individuals and as a society. And so I think that one of the few benefits of the pandemic is that many people have had to slow down their lives. We're not following our daily routines. We're not going to the usual workplace. We're sequestered in our homes. Of course, those of us, I'm not speaking, of course, the healthcare workers and the service workers who I have great admiration for, but the rest of us, we've had to slow down. And I think that is a very needed and welcome habit of mine to develop, and learning how to just be quiet for a while, to get off the treadmill of the frantic pace of modern life.
Yeah, I totally hear you on that. I've been practicing meditation for almost 10 years now, and I find, but for me, it was actually not a big challenge to stay at home for long periods of time alone. And then I have other friends who this was hell for them, just not being able to go outside and meet people. And I think a lot of people were in this middle ground where they actually had to figure out how to do this and be alone with their thoughts. And then once they figured it out, they actually, now they have a new skill. Where in the world were you hunkering down for most of this?
I live in a little town that's about 20 miles west of Boston. I teach at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is in Cambridge, which is right next to Boston. And I lived there from September to May. And in the summer months, my wife and I live on a very small island in the state of Maine, which is the northeast part of the United States. And there are a lot of little islands here. And that's where I am right now, on a very small island in the state of Maine.
Moving into the conversation, we like to start with the person, because I believe that the personal journey always has a lot to do with later decisions in the projects. And so the question that we found that works quite well to open up this conversation is, what's something that you've learned early in life or as a child that still drives you today, that is still powering what you're doing today?
Well, I've never thought about that. I learned early in life that I had a passion for both the sciences and the humanities. And I don't know whether that's the kind of thing you're talking about, but my parents and my teachers and my friends were always trying to push me in one direction, either be a scientist type, someone who thinks rationally, who's deliberate, versus the artistic type, someone who's more spontaneous, likes ambiguity. And I had two groups of friends, the artist types and the scientist types, and I felt very comfortable with both of them. I did notice that my parents, my friends, and my teachers were trying to nudge me in one direction or the other. So I think that life is a little bit easier. It's certainly a little more straightforward if you're either the scientist type or the artist type. And I use those scientists and artists very broadly to indicate sort of two different ways of being in the world. So that's something I learned about myself at an early age, and it has been part of my career.
I did some reading, and it looks like even early in life, you were winning all these state fairs, both in science and in writing and in English. And so it sounds like it started early on. And then later in your career, you write often about questions of physics, but through prose and through poetry. And they're beautifully written stories, essays, or poems that have their artistry in them. And it feels like a theme that you took forward with you. You studied physics initially in Princeton, correct?
Yes.
And so whenever I think about Princeton, I think about Richard Feynman's description of Princeton, which I love, which he called it an imitation Oxford, Cambridge, complete with accents. And this is where the title, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, came from, where whenever he made a social error, they told you, surely you're joking. What was your experience? Because Feynman is probably 30 years before your time, right?
Yeah, Feynman was on my thesis committee, my PhD thesis committee at Caltech. I did not find Princeton to be an imitation of Oxford and Cambridge. I think all the Ivy League universities in the United States, it's slightly pretentious, but I did not feel that it was trying to emulate the British universities. And when I was there, which was in the 1970s, actually in the late 1960s, it was a quiet, leafy campus with a lot of beautiful places to walk. And I found that sort of fed my spiritual side. I took a lot of long walks on the campus. Of course, there were a lot of great minds there. And I made friends with some of the great professors in science and in the humanities, and was very privileged to be able to do that.
Yeah, it sounds like he grew also to love it, but he came in from MIT, which at the time was very different, and he was forced to wear gowns and shared meals, and he was like, what is this place?
Right. Well, I can see how he would feel that way coming from MIT.
Yeah. So then you moved on to Caltech, right? And that must be fairly different in character. And I also read some stories about you and Feynman at Caltech, which were interesting. Do you want to tell any memorable thing from that period?
At Caltech, I was in the group of Kip Thorne, who's a physicist, works in relativity theory. And Kip won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for the discovery of gravitational waves. And Kip had a group of about 6 graduate students, maybe 4 graduate students and 2 postdocs. And Feynman was interested in everything going on in physics. In 1972, which was during the years I was a graduate student, the first black hole was discovered called Cygnus X1. That raised great excitement around the world. And Feynman sometimes went to lunch with us graduate students in Kip Thorne's group to pick our brains about what was happening in black hole physics. What were the new thoughts, both experimentally or theoretically? So that was very interesting to have lunch with him maybe once every few months.
He must have been a character. I mostly consumed the stories about him and then watching his famous lectures. And
he was quite a character. I can tell you one story that probably was not in his book. Surely you're joking. There was a strip joint in Pasadena named the High Life, and Feynman was a customer of this. He went there, and they were sued by the city of Pasadena, which tried to close them down. And I heard and believe that Feynman testified at the court trial and said that he got inspiration for some of his physics while he was at the strip joint.
That sounds like Feynman. That sounds very much like it.
Right. He scribbled equations on napkins while he was looking at the performances on stage.
Yeah, that's Feynman for you.
That's Feynman.
I grew up reading Feynman stories, and I think at a time where I needed motivation in my life, and that was great to see an adult that still has that passion for living. Was a great thing.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about your writing and how it started, and specifically the story of Einstein's dreams, because up until that point, you're mostly doing very serious physics. And how did that come about? Do you have this need from childhood, or what made you decide to go down that path?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was very interested in the arts and humanities as well as science. From a very young age, I built rockets, and I also wrote poetry as a child. And I knew that I wanted to somehow pursue both my artistic interest, which was mainly expressed in writing, and my scientific interest. But I didn't know exactly how I could do that. I did know and had observed that some scientists later in life became writers, like C.P. Snow. But I didn't know of any examples of writers who later in life became scientists. I now understand why that is, but I didn't understand at the time. I just knew that was a fact. So I decided that early in my career, where I would get myself well established in science, but I wouldn't give up my writing. I would just do it as a hobby. So in the early 1980s, I began writing essays. At that time, this was 8 years after my PhD. I was an assistant professor at Harvard. I had done a postdoc. I was already well into my scientific career, and I began writing essays about science, but with a humanistic perspective, and publishing those essays. And the essay is a very flexible literary form. You can be informative, you can be poetic, you can be personal, you can be philosophical. So the essay form gave me a lot of freedom to explore my different interests. And as time went on, my essays began to get more experimental, and I began to introduce fictional elements into the essays. And I started publishing the essays in 1982 in a magazine called Smithsonian Magazine, and then there were other magazines. I published some in the New Yorker, and around 1990 or so, I got the idea for Einstein's dreams. So it wasn't my first writing experience. I had been writing and publishing since the early 1980s. And also I had published entire books of essays. So Einstein's Dreams was not my first book, but it was certainly my first extended meditation.
And it was, it seems like the one that really made your career as a writer in this way that it's still, it's still talked about today. And there's something beautiful about how you make these very abstract concepts, like different possibilities for the nature of time, and making it real and human on an emotional level. What would it mean for time to be cyclical, right? What would it mean for time to be this or that way? And I think it has this enduring power to this day to be in Einstein's dream. It's a wonderful vehicle for exploring all of that.
One of the influences for that book was a little book by Italo Calvino called Invisible Cities. I don't know whether you know that book.
I heard the name, but I haven't read the book.
Yeah. Like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and other writers, Italo Calvino was a magic realist. And he distorted reality in order to see it more clearly. And he wrote a little book called Invisible Cities. I can't remember exactly when it was published. It might have been in the 50s. And in that book, he imagines that Kublai Khan, who wants to know what all the different places of his empire is so vast, he hasn't even gone to all of the places. He sends out the great European traveler and explorer, Marco Polo, to go investigate his realm and make reports back. And each chapter of the little book is like a 2-page description of one of the cities in Kublai Khan's empire.
Wow.
And very beautiful, poetic. And so I had read that book. Of course, every writer is influenced by hundreds of books. That one appealed to me particularly. And that was in my mind when I came up with the idea for Einstein's dreams of having all the different worlds of time. So I was sort of doing what Calvino had done for space. I was doing it for time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's an interesting origin story. So before kind of moving on to the more later books, there seems to be a connection between, or at least recently, I'm noticing this pattern of people who write about physics in this almost spiritual way, or maybe even wouldn't say almost. I would just say, there's a convergence of the physics, not the physical, but physics, and the spiritual. And in this tradition, you can find people like Carlo Rovelli, but if you go back in time, people like Spinoza even, who has his own kind of physicist kind of spirituality. Is there an inherent connection? How do you make sense of that? Because you're also in that tradition.
Yeah, I know Carlo Rovelli's work, but I don't think that there are a lot of people like Carlo Rovelli or me who are writing about science in this way. Of course, if you go back a few centuries, Darwin and you mentioned Spinoza, lots of people. There certainly are a lot of connections if you view science as a human activity, as an exploration of the world, which it is, of course. And some of the deepest questions in physics in particular, like how did the universe get this way? Where did it come from? Have a theological dimension as well as a scientific dimension. Why is there something rather than nothing? It's a great philosophical question, but it's also a question in physics. But I think that it's not automatic that a physicist would write about physics or science in a spiritual way. I think it depends on the particular personality.
Yeah. So this question of origin. So I'm going to quote from your latest book. According to modern analysis of the DNA of fossil animals, your ancestral mother descended from more primitive creatures, and those from more primitive until we reach single-celled organisms squirming and gyrating in a primeval sea. And then you continue to say, and those first living organisms that emerged from the billions of random collisions of lifeless molecules by chance forming things that could spawn more of themselves and tap energy from the roiling sea. And before that, the ancient air of earth methane and ammonia and water vapor and nitrogen blew over the seething volcanoes. And before, the gases swirled and condensed from a cloud in the primeval solar system. That's almost like an origin story, a religious origin story.
Mm-hmm.
And this makes me think of entropy and negative entropy as these forces that Schrödinger wrote about in his book, What is Life?
I know that book.
Yeah. And I think there's so much movement of big history. It's talking about history from the Big Bang on as a continuum of what does physics have to say about this process that is something's going on and we're still in it and we're still experiencing it even as humans in our daily lives and in our societies. As a physicist, how is your view of this different from someone who's just wondering at
I think physics, certainly in the 20th century, has filled in a lot of the blanks. Things which were either in the realm of philosophy or theology have now been put on a scientific footing. I mean, it was physicists and astronomers who discovered that these fuzzy patches of light we see in the sky are actually whole galaxies. That our galaxy is a finite thing of a certain number of stars, and that there are other galaxies with a lot of space in between. Physicists have discovered in the 20th century that the universe is expanding, it's evolving, and if so, that means it had a beginning, because you can play that movie backwards in time to a definite point in the past when all of the material in the observable universe was squeezed into a very tiny region. So in the last, say, couple of 100 years, or maybe 150 years, physics and astronomy have been able to fill in a lot of the blanks and take questions that were formerly theological or philosophical and place them on a firm scientific footing. And for example, in the early 1920s, we discovered that these misty patches, milky misty patches in the sky are whole galaxies. And a new method was developed to measure the size of our galaxy. And we realized that there were other entire galaxies beyond our galaxy. We also, in the late 20s, found evidence, this is the 1920s, found evidence that our universe is expanding, that it's not static in time as people had believed for thousands of years, including Einstein believed that it was a static universe. Physicists found evidence that the universe is expanding, and that means it had a beginning in time. If you just play the movie backwards of the expanding universe, everything moves together, and from the rate of expansion, you can tell when a definite point in the past, which is called the Big Bang, when all of the matter of the observable universe was squeezed into a region smaller than a single atom. And we call that the beginning of our universe. These are profound discoveries that physics has made just in the last 100 years. So I think that in a very large sense, our view of ourselves has changed. Of course, if the universe had a beginning, then it raises the question, what made it begin? Was there anything before? And the best ideas now in theoretical physics is that lots of universes are constantly coming into being through quantum physics. Most of those universes don't have the right conditions to keep expanding, but some of them do. One of them became our universe. And some physicists believe that there was no beginning of time. There was a beginning of our universe, but there was time before our universe in which other universes were born.
Yeah. And one of the things kind of tied back to like this story of creation and this almost spiritual story, one of the things that you find amidst these insights is something you call the rarity of life and the implications of that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, very recently, with observations of a satellite called the Kepler satellite, which was launched about 5 years ago, we've been able to make an estimate of what fraction of stars have habitable planets orbiting them. And it's something like 10%. So even if you assume that every habitable planet that could have life actually does have life, you can estimate what fraction of all material in the universe is in living form. For example, we know on Earth, we know approximately how large the biosphere is, how much mass is in the living form. And we can extrapolate that and add it to the Kepler observations. We can make an estimate that about 1/billionth of 1/billionth of all of the material in the universe is in living form. That is, has a special arrangement of atoms and molecules that we call life. That is an extremely small fraction. And one way to think about that very small number is it's equivalent to a few grains of sand on the Gobi Desert.
Right.
And all of the rest of the Gobi Desert is non-living material, and a few grains of sand out of that vast desert are in living form. So that means that life is very rare in the universe.
Yeah. And you also talk about the rarity in time, because you talk about this evolving universe. And I think you said in a universe that's about 1 billion years old to about 1,000 billion years old, that's the sweet spot where life could even exist. And based on what we know, most of the life of the universe will, be without life.
Without life. Yes. Of course, from 1 billion years to 1,000 billion years is a lot of time, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the full life of the universe.
Right. And we're at 14 already. So we're
at 14 already.
Wasted.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So it seems that life is rare both in space and in time. And so if you're philosophically inclined, like I am, what do you make of that fact? Does it mean anything? And I think that it gives us living things, we precious few grains of sand living in this narrow window of time, it gives us a special role in the universe as being the spectators or the witnesses, that out of all of the matter in the universe, that we have the special position of being able to comment on the universe. It also, to me, and this is pretty abstract, but for me, it provides a connection between me and all living things in the universe. Even probably we on Earth will never in our lifetimes make contact with other living things in the universe. I mean, outside of our solar system, probably. And yet we have this connection in being among these few grains of sand in this narrow window of time, that we are the living things in the universe. So it provides a kind of kinship.
Yeah. And it's almost this tragic, gloomy thing where you can imagine other creatures realizing, just like we're realizing, that they're here for such a brief time. And it's beautiful. And you write about having this reverence for life because it's so precious, because it's so fleeting in the grand scheme of things, that it becomes more sacred to us.
I think so.
Yeah. And yet, somewhere else you say, or you said that the distinction between life and death may be overrated. Would you care to explain that?
Well, what I mean by that is that if you think of life as consciousness, we can't imagine being in the world without consciousness. It's not an all or nothing thing. It's graded. It's not only graded from lower non-human animals up to human beings, but even within human beings, there are different levels of consciousness. In some mental illnesses, consciousness fades gradually. And of course, mental illness is a terrible thing, but many of us know people or even relatives who have had mental illness, Alzheimer's, other similar, and we can see their sense of self slowly ebbing away. If you think of life and death as the complete absence of consciousness, then you can sort of gradually drift towards death without it being a sudden all or nothing thing. And that's what I mean by that statement.
Yeah, and that seems to definitely be true. We have this tendency of creating these very binary categories.
Right.
Whereas when you go out in the world and actually try to find them and find that clear line, you never find it.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Nature doesn't do things with an all or nothing way. Everything is gradual in nature.
Yeah.
Well, the statement that everything is gradual in nature is one of Moses Mendelssohn's arguments for the existence of the soul, the immortal soul. He was a very great 18th century Jewish philosopher and thinker, and he was one of the strongest proponents for the immortal soul. But unlike a lot of predecessors, he didn't take that as a given, but actually gave scientific rational arguments of why the soul should be immortal. And one of his arguments was that there's nothing in nature which is all or nothing, that everything is gradual. So you can't have a person's soul suddenly disappear just when their physical body ends.
Yeah. Interesting. This is reminds me of Buddhist philosophers of emptiness, and specifically Chandrakirti, which is one of the maybe two great philosophers of emptiness in Buddhism, where he talks about the seed and the plant, and how at no point the seed disappears and is replaced by a plant. It's all continuous. I think that's really another fact of nature that is interesting to ponder and that has spiritual consequences. So you write from your latest book, Probable Impossibilities, and also the whole discussion about the reverence of life and the rarity of life is from there. You write about infinity and nothingness. And so I want to give a couple of quotes. One is your own from The Infinity of the Small and the Infinity of the Large. You write about the unending world of ever smaller things within the atom and the unending world of ever larger things beyond our telescopes. Between these two endpoints of the imagination are we human beings, fragile and brief, clutching our thin slice of reality, which is one of the most beautiful statements I've read about the human condition. And then you quote Pascal, who writes, "He who regards himself in this light will be afraid of himself and observing himself sustained in the body, giving him by nature between these two abysses of the infinite and nothing, will tremble at the sight of these marvels." And then this is the key. Man is equally incapable of seeing the nothing from which he was made and the infinite in which he is swallowed up. And both of these read like the ultimate spiritual definition of where we are in regard to the world, which is the biggest question of life. So how did you come to this idea of the infinity?
The difference between me and Pascal on this notion of the nothingness from which we came and the infinity which were swallowed up is Pascal had a pessimistic, fearful reaction to that fact. He said, I think he used the word frightened, and of course it's a translation from the French. But I think that we should not be frightened. The fact that we can imagine and discuss these two infinities, the infinity of the small and infinity of the large, and actually think about them scientifically, to me, is a reason to celebrate that it's a triumph of the human mind that we can conceive and even explore scientifically these two different infinities. I think is a great tribute to the power of the human mind.
Yeah, and you explore all of these questions that have to do with infinity, like what came before the Big Bang, and there's these different theories. And one that struck me is the idea of two-headed time. If you could explain what that means. That was the first time I heard of that concept. And then we can maybe talk a little bit more about the current favorite, which is the inflation theory or the multiverse theory.
Well, the theory of two-headed time, which has been postulated by Alan Guth and his collaborators, is that the Big Bang, which is the point where we believe that our universe came into being, that time existed before then in sort of a mirror image of everything that's happened after that. Before the Big Bang, the universe was once much larger. It got smaller and smaller. The galaxies moving closer to each other reached a state of minimum size or maximum compression at the Big Bang, and then began expanding after that. And the direction of time is in the direction of things getting larger. So time was going backwards before the Big Bang and forwards after it. And if you drew arrows in the direction that time was moving in, at the Big Bang, those arrows would move away from it in both directions, both before the Big Bang and after the Big Bang. So that's the idea of it. It hasn't been fleshed out. And in fact, in order to have any believable theory of how the universe began and what might have come before, we need to find a way of merging two areas of physics, one called quantum physics and one called general relativity, which is a theory of gravity. And the two merged together would be in a theory called quantum gravity. We do not yet have such a theory, but we hope that when we do have such a theory, that it will tell us more about how our universe began and what came before.
Yeah. And you write about the multiverse option through Andre Linde's story, and you describe it as this thicket of bulbs that each of them is a different universe, and some of them are expanding and some of them are collapsing, and which is, of course, mind-blowing. And then you write, how can anything we do be of consequence when we are nowhere in space, nowhere in time, when our brief lives are lived out on one small planet, itself one of zillions of planets, in a universe that may be infinite in size, and our entire universe simply one bulb in Linde's thick hedge of universes? So how can we find our place in this kind of picture?
Well, one thing that I've come to believe as I've gotten older is that there is no cosmic purpose. Each person has to find meaning in his or her individual. Each of us has to decide on our own what matters to us, what has meaning. What has meaning and what matters to me might not be the same as what has meaning and matters to you. I think all of us, either consciously or unconsciously, are searching for meaning. But unless you're a very religious person and you believe that the meaning of the cosmos is given to you by God, and I respect that belief, even though it's not my belief, unless you have meaning spelled out to you, for you by some higher being, then you've got to find it on your own. And when I say it, I don't mean that there is a single meaning. I mean that each of us has to find out what has meaning to us individually.
Yeah. Yeah. And you find meaning in the same paragraph in being a part of this complex system, and being, some people feel like they're one with the system, like they are the system. But even being just a part of that system can be quite thrilling.
Well, I think so. And I think that each of us is part of this long chain of humanity going back millions of years. Well, I guess the first human beings were 2 million years ago.
I have two more questions for you. So you write in praise of wasting time, despite knowing how rare our time is and how brief in the grand scheme of things. And you write this is a beautiful story of, you go to this very rural village in Cambodia, and each morning the women ride their bicycles. It's this beautiful description because they ride their bicycle in a dirt road to the market, which is 10 miles away. And then you ask one of the women how long that trip takes every day. And you write, she gave me a puzzled look and said, I never thought about that. So how is that? So and you said you envied that woman. What do you have to say as a physicist or as you about time and why wasting it could be a good thing?
Well, we were talking earlier about the frantic pace of the modern world and how we're all rushing from A to B all the time and checking our smartphones every 5 minutes and trying to whittle down the day to 10-minute units of efficiency, which doesn't leave us time to reflect or think about what's important to us. By wasting time, spending time in a way that's not goal-oriented, where you're not trying to accomplish anything, you're not trying to get from A to B. You're just being in the world. And it might be sitting quietly reading a book, it might be taking a walk, but you're not trying to accomplish anything. And I think that time is very valuable. I think it's, for one thing, it's where a lot of creativity takes place, when we're just letting our minds wander and think about things that your mind wants to think about, not what you're telling it to think about. It's right. Also, you mentioned Buddhism. I think that the Buddhists have known for a long, long time that we need periods in which we replenish the mind, we restore the mind, and you need quiet to do that. So I think that there are a number of reasons why I think it's good to waste time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that it corresponds with a lot of Eastern traditions. Like in Taoism, there's this concept of wu-wei, which is doing without aim, without trying to achieve something. And it just makes me think of a great book I read recently about finite and infinite games by James Cars. And essentially, these two approaches to life. One is finite, which means that you're trying to achieve something and it's going to have an end. And, when you achieve it, it's done. The game is over. And one is infinite, which is doing for its own sake. And that ties so beautifully also with your infinity challenge, which is embracing the infinity is maybe one of our spiritual challenges as human beings. So I have a final question for you. And my observation is that scientists haven't loved this question. So everyone else likes it fine, but scientists don't love this. But this is based on Alain de Botton's TED Talk. And he talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And he says, a lecture is a little bit sterile. It's a way of giving a little bit of information. It's not passionate. It's not essential. It's not emotional. A sermon is trying to change your life. A sermon is urgently trying to get you to understand something important. And so if I gave you a stage for people who are not scientists or not physicists, and if you want to give them a sermon for something that could change their lives for the better, that could, help them experience some of what you've experienced, what would you tell them?
Something that will change their life. I would say, try to spend an hour each day without being connected to the internet. Turn your smartphone off, turn your computer off, and just spend an hour a day alone with your thoughts. And see, first of all, most people can't handle that, but just see whether you can do it. And if you succeed in doing that several days in a row, I believe that your mind will go to new places where it hasn't been before, and you might learn some things about yourself and about the world.
For sure. Thank you very much, Alan. This was wonderful.
Well, it's great talking to you, and it's an interesting program that you have.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.